Panama Canal by Jacob Stewart. Stretching for 48 miles, the Panama Canal was the most incredible feat of engineering up until that time. Through the collaboration of a few countries, a new waterway was created to greatly reduce the amount of time and money spent on shipping goods from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. For centuries, the idea of having a canal through Central America was just a dream. In 1524, a suggestion was made to King Charles V to cut out a piece of land to speed up the trade to Asia. Unfortunately, due to the technology of the time, the idea was never really discussed. Phase 1. The French Effort, from 1880 to 1889. On January 1st, 1880, a man by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps from France set out to build such a canal. His plan called for a sea level canal, much like the Suez Canal, which he had helped to develop in 1859. However, over the course of 7 years, the workers had only cut a 74-foot swath through the jungle by hand. In 1889, the French, along with Ferdinand de Lesseps, gave up after 9 years of hard labor in which well over 20,000 people died due to disease. The French government during this period had spent $260 million with very little success. When the French left, they left behind everything that was associated with the project. As far back as 1850, the U.S. and Great Britain had been negotiating over who would have rights to the canal in Central America. The resulting treaty would become known as the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. In 1901, the Hay-Ponce-Forte Treaty gave the U.S. exclusive rights to a canal as it repealed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Following shortly thereafter, the U.S. began to negotiate with Colombia to gain rights to the canal zone on the Isthmus of Panama. After Colombia rejected the treaty, President Theodore Roosevelt sent the U.S. Navy to support Panamanian rebellion forces to guarantee their independence. This conflict turned out to be rather clean, as only one shopkeeper and donkey were killed. To remove the remaining Colombian troops from Panama, the U.S. government simply paid them to go back to Colombia. On November 18, 1903, Panama and the U.S. signed the Hay-Buena-Varilla Treaty to transfer all ownership rights to the U.S. in regard to the 10-mile-wide strip that would become the canal zone. Phase 2. The American Effort, from 1904 to 1914. Starting in 1904, the U.S. paid the French $40 million for their property and rights and paid Panama $10 million for the 10-mile-wide strip that would become known as the Canal Zone. Following the acquisition of the Canal Zone, President Roosevelt appointed John Finley Wallace on May 6, 1904, to be the chief engineer of the project. He tried to start up where the French left off, but found that to be rather difficult, as the French machinery was obsolete, the infrastructure was too small, and the conditions were far from what he was used to. The work that he tried to get done suffered from going through the Isthmian Canal Commission. For fear of his own personal health, he resigned to return home. His resignation proved to Roosevelt the challenge that they were facing, and it caused new budget reforms to make the budget more realistic. To replace John Wallace, President Roosevelt appointed John Frank Stevens to be the chief engineer. He would oversee construction of the canal from 1905 to 1907. On August 1, 1905, John Stevens ended the work on Culebra Cut to build 1,250 homes, hospitals, and other amenities for the workers. Unlike his predecessor, he would write letters directly to the president in order to get the support that he needed. He personally went to Washington, D.C. himself to convince Roosevelt that a sea-level canal would not work and that a lock canal would be a much better solution. Steam shovels, like the one shown, were used by the workers to dig the massive amounts of dirt to create the canal. Unfortunately, this is what they had to listen to. At the same time that John Stevens took over the construction, a man by the name of William C. Gorgas fixed the disease problem that had been plaguing the project. Unlike other people, he had been asking to go to Panama to stop the spread of yellow fever and other diseases. He had, in essence, started a war on mosquitoes by starting the most expensive health campaign in history that would not have gotten support from Roosevelt had it not been for Roosevelt's personal physician. His plan was simply to cover and seal containers of water, put screens around infected patients so the mosquitoes couldn't become infected, and fumigate homes. To kill mosquito larvae in bodies of water, crude oil was pumped onto the surface to prevent the larvae from ever becoming adults. His plan went as far as to create laws that made it punishable by law with a $5 fine for having one mosquito larvae. By 1906, he had eradicated yellow fever, with malaria soon to follow. In 1906, President Roosevelt would leave the U.S. and travel to Panama and Puerto Rico. He had purposely chosen to go to Panama during the rainy season to see what it was like at its worst. When he arrived, he had snuck onto the mainland in order to visit the hospitals to talk to the injured workers to get their opinions. During his 12 days at the Canal Zone, he had made the workers feel pride in their work and what they were doing. He even went to operate one of the steam shovels himself. In 1907, John Stevens resigned and was replaced by U.S. Major General George Washington Goethals. Unlike Stevens or Wallace, he did not give in. When the steam shovel operators demanded a 40% pay increase, he fired them and proceeded to hire new operators. Under his watch, the work at Culebra Cut became a 24/7 operation. Unfortunately, rock slides became very common, and at one point, Goethals had the railroad tracks extended to the cemetery to bury people faster. In 1909, when it came time to start building the locks themselves, well over 5 million bags of concrete were used to make the concrete on site. At Gatun alone, 2 million cubic yards were poured to create the lock structures. To create the structures themselves, large buckets filled with concrete, which weighed about 6 tons, would be lifted and poured into large square molds. The locks themselves would be 42 feet deep, 110 feet wide, 1,000 feet long. Each would have 4 or more miter gates that were watertight and hollow. Strangely, these gates were so well balanced that a single 40 horsepower electric motor was all that was needed to move the gates. Each lock would hold 52 million gallons of water that was filled by culverts and gravity. Power for the canal would be provided by a hydroelectric dam at Gatun. Over time, modifications have been made to the Panama Canal. In the 1930s, more dams were constructed to ensure that there'd be enough water for operation, and in 2007, work began to make a third set of locks that'd be 1,400 feet long, 180 feet wide, and 60 feet deep. Over the course of the U.S.'s operation of the Panama Canal from 1914 to 1999, in 1997, on September 7th, President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty with Panamanian dictator Omar Torrijos that would give the Panama Canal to Panama, thereby reuniting the country after being separated by the canal. In total, 25,609 people died, and the U.S. spent $375 million and poured 5 million cubic yards of concrete.